Welcome to the Stay Cozy Saguaro Cactus tutorial. Today I'll be showing you how to make this little cactus, and we'll be using hand crochet techniques and tube yarn. The blooming flowers on top will be an optional add-on, which I will show you how to do. And here's a couple different options showing you the difference between our yarns. The one on the bottom is our velvet tube yarn, while the one in the middle and the top are cotton tube yarn. If you purchase my DIY kit, then it should include one skein of tube yarn, needle, and thread. You will need to provide your own scissors. If you only purchase the tutorial and are in need of supplies, you can find a DIY kit on my website at staycozyco.com, or you can buy the yarn separately. So let's get started. When working with tube yarn, you're going to find the end of the yarn piece, and we're first going to fold back the outside fabric and cut out about 1 to 2 inches of fluff on the inside. This will just make it easier to sew up the end of our yarn so that we don't have any fluff sticking out or any that we're losing while we're working with it. So now we're going to take the outside fabric and tuck it back in on itself to make a nice looking end. And then you're going to grab your needle and thread and just sew up the end all the way across. I usually just start on one side and then do a simple loop straight through both sides of the fabric to connect them and then back around. If you're very uncomfortable with sewing or really just don't want to do this step, you are welcome to tie a knot at the end of your yarn. So you would cut out a little more fluff to give yourself a little more fabric to work with, and then tie a knot at the end of your yarn. If you're sewing like I am, when you get to the end and knot your thread, I like to push my needle back through the yarn to hide the tail and then just trim it off right at the end. You can now set your needle and thread as well as your scissors aside, and we're going to get started with our hand crochet. Find the tail of your tube yarn, and we're going to make a magic circle by wrapping the yarn around our hand, tucking a loop into the center, and then making a slip stitch here to hold it in place. So we're just going to pull another loop through that first loop that we made and pull it snug. And now we're going to make 5 single crochet stitches into the center of our circle. So we're going to put our hands through that first loop, reach into the center, pull a second loop through. So we have 2 loops on our hands. And then we're going to pull a new loop through both of those loops. And that's our first single crochet stitch. So we're going to do this 4 more times around the circle. And when working with tube yarn, you want to make sure that you don't make your loops too tight, otherwise it'll make it really hard on your hands to be pulling loops through. So you want to make sure that you can fit at least 2 fingers through and possibly 3. Here I'm pulling on the tail of my yarn to tighten up that circle, so you can kind of do that each time you make a new stitch. Just pull on the tail to tighten it up, and then after we've made all 5 single crochet stitches, we'll pull on that tail really tight to cinch up the center so that there's not a hole. So I've made 3 single crochet stitches, and I'm going to make my 4th now by reaching into the center of that circle, pulling a loop through, and then pulling a new loop through both of those. So now we have 4, and you really want just a little bit of space left when you're making your 5th stitch. So just pull in there, pull your loop through, and finish off your last stitch. And now that you have 5, you really want to pull tightly on that tail to cinch up the end. And then we're going to be building our cactus up from here, so you can kind of push it up into a circle. And we're going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stitches. So to begin our first round, we're going to pull this tail into the center of our circle, and we're going to be reaching that last stitch across. This little loop here is where we started our slip stitch, and then this is actually our first single crochet stitch, so that's the one that we want to go into. So we're going to be reaching across there and just going into the top strand of that loop, and we're going to pull a new loop through and then a loop through both of those. So that's going to be our first single crochet stitch. And so we're going to do 5 all the way around, just like we did with our magic circle. So this is our second single crochet stitch. And then for our third one, we're going to go into that next stitch And for this cactus, we're only working through that back part of the stitch, so we aren't going through both strands. We're just going to go through that top one. And the reason we only go through one of the strands is because, one, this cactus is pretty small and this yarn is pretty big, and so it just gets kind of hard to pull your yarn through, and there's enough structure only going through one strand to hold it together. So we've done 4 single crochets so far, and I'm going to finish off my 5th one, and this will complete that first round. We're going to continue for 3 more rounds in the same way by making 5 single crochet stitches in each round. So you can see this is where we started with our slip stitch, and then counting our loops around, there was 5, and then counting again for that next round is 5. So if you ever lose count, you can always go back to the bottom part of your cactus and count up. So we're going to be starting our second round, and we're going to be doing 4 rounds total of single crochet stitches. So I'm going to keep working in this way until I'm at the top of my cactus. If you are having a hard time with this stitch, please feel free to stop, pause, rewind as many times as you need to make sure that you understand how to do this. And if you feel like you have the hang of it, feel free to work forward and fast forward this video to the top of the cactus where I'll show you how to close up the end. I also want you to pay attention to the size of your loops. Sometimes they can tend to get too small, and it can really strain your wrist and your fingers if you're pulling really hard to pull that yarn through. So if you find that that's happening to you, you can loosen up your stitches a little bit and make them a little bit bigger. And also make sure that you take time to stretch out your fingers and wrists, especially if you aren't used to hand crochet. I don't want you to hurt your wrist while starting off this project. Okay, so we have now finished our magic circle with 5 single crochets as well as 4 rounds of 5 single crochets, and it's time to grab our scissors, and we're going to cut about a 6-inch tail of yarn, and we're going to close up the top part of our cactus. Find the last loop that you made and pull your tail all the way through that. And now we're going to weave this tail around the top part of our cactus. So I just went into that next stitch. I went from the outside to the inside, and then now I'm going to weave from the inside to the outside in the next stitch and kind of just continue in this way all the way around the top part so that I cinch that circle closed. And you can gently pull on the tail as you go, just cinching that hole closed in the top. And when you make your way back around to where you began, you're just going to find that last stitch, and you're going to weave the yarn through there. So some of this is more of how does it look, not an exact science, but you just want to cinch up the top and make sure that it looks pretty even. And then we're going to find a place to connect our yarn. So you can cut the tail a little bit shorter at this time. And then we're going to cut out some of the fluff just like we did in the beginning to make it easier to sew. If you are trying to avoid sewing and want to use a knot again, you are welcome to do that. You will just need a little bit longer tail and to cut out a little more fluff. And I would recommend making your knot pretty big so that your top of your cactus doesn't come undone, but you could make a knot and then push that into the center of your cactus to hide it. However, I do recommend using the sewing method because it just looks a little nicer and is more secure. So we're going to fold back the outside of the tube yarn, cut out some of the fluff, and then tuck that outside fabric in on itself for a nice finished end. And then I usually try and find the closest stitch to the tail end that I can tuck this under to hide it. So I'm going to use this one right here, and then I'm going to just kind of push that stitch over so that I can sew the tail onto the underside so that when it's done, then it's hidden. So my goal here is to connect the tail to that stitch and also close up the tail so that none of the fluff comes out. So again, as in the beginning, we're going to work our way all the way across until that tail is closed. And then I like to make a knot and then push my needle back through to hide the tail. And that way you can trim the thread really close without losing the end. And when you're done, then you just kind of roll that stitch back into place and the end is hidden. And congratulations, you've made the first and biggest part of our cactus. Or if you want to leave it like this, I suppose you could make it into a pickle, but we're going to add some arms to it to make it look more cactus-like. I'm now just trying to figure out where I want to put the arms, and you're welcome to put them really wherever you like. If you want your cactus to be a little more asymmetrical, you can do that. However, I want mine to be kind of in the center, so I'm looking for stitches that look about in the middle on both sides of the cactus so they can be kind of even. But no matter where you put the arm, you want two strands that are kind of parallel to each other. So we're going to take a new tail of yarn and tuck a loop from the top to the bottom in one of the strands, and then we're going to make a loop from the bottom to the top in the strand above it. So you should have two loops sticking out away from each other. And you want these loops to be about the same size that you've been working with all along, and then you need just a few inches of tail. And then we're going to pull these loops together. Pull your working yarn around to the underside of them and pull a new loop up and through both of them. So if you look at your cactus from the front, it should look like a little arm that is sticking up. And then we're going to pull a new loop up through that final loop. So from the back to the front. And that's going to finish off our arm. You can grab your scissors now, and we're going to cut a tail just a few inches long, and we're going to tuck it from the back to the front in that final loop. And we're going to pull that a little snug, not too tight, but you want it to just kind of be snug around the top arm. And then we're actually going to connect these two tails so that we can limit the amount of sewing that we need to do. So I'm tucking this bottom tail up through one of the back sides of the stitches. And then I'm going to take the top tail and I'm going to cut out a few inches of fluff so that we can more easily connect these strands. You can now grab your needle and thread, and we're going to push that bottom tail into the top tail where we've taken out the fluff. So we're going to put the fluffy parts together and then pull the outside of that top tail down and around it, and then tuck up the outside edges to make a clean end. And then we're going to sew all the way around those strands to connect them and make a nice finish. So if you find that your tails are having a hard time staying together, you can kind of pull on them more snugly together so that you have room to sew all the way around. And then when we're done, we're going to tuck that sewed seam behind that strand that the bottom tail has been pulled through. But right now we're going to focus on sewing all the way around these strands. So I like to work all the way around, like in the circumference of the strands, just because going straight through the yarn can sometimes get tangled in the stuffing on the inside. So you just kind of have to turn that strand over so you can reach the back side, and then at some point push your needle to the other side to finish that all the way around. And again, when you're done closing this up, you can push your needle all the way through the yarn, trim off the tail, and then we're going to find that seam and just kind of tuck it behind that strand so that you can't see it. And now it's well hidden, and you have completed one arm of your cactus. Great job! Now we're going to do the exact same thing on the other side to add another arm. We're going to find 2 strands again that are parallel to each other, and it's not going to be exact, but I'm going to choose these 2 strands on the side, and we're going to get started with our loops. So I'm going to take the bottom strand and I'm going to push a new loop down through there, and you want the tail to be sticking out of what would be the back side of your cactus. Even though we're going to be hiding that tail, I just like to stay consistent. So we have these 2 loops. We're going to pull those together, and I want to make sure that I have enough tail so I can easily connect it to the top one when I'm done. But we're going to pull our working yarn down around to the bottom side, push a new loop up and through, and then we're going to push another new loop from the back side to the front to finish off that arm. And now you can grab your scissors. We're going to cut the tail of our yarn, and remember to leave enough so that you can connect it to that bottom tail. And we're going to loop it up through that final loop from the back to the front and then pull it around back. Then we're going to tuck that bottom tail up through one of the strands on the back side of the cactus arm, just like we did on the other side. And then we're going to cut some of the fluff out of this top tail so that we can connect it to the bottom tail. So we'll pull that outside fabric down and then tuck it in on itself, and then take that bottom tail and push it into that kind of sleeve that we've made. And then you'll need your needle and thread, and we are going to sew all the way around just like we did on the other side to close off that yarn and make sure none of the fluff comes out and that those tails don't come disconnected. So once you're done with that, we hide the tail of that thread, snip it off, and then you can push that seam down behind that back strand so that it is hidden. And with that, we have completed our mini cactus. Congratulations! I hope that you enjoyed making this little cactus. I love it so much. And if you want to just leave it as is, you can. Otherwise, you can keep watching to see how I make some different flowers to put on top. I'm going to show you 2 different ways to connect these, but you will need a little bit of chenille yarn for that yellow spot in the center, and then the white fluff is actually from the remainder of our tube yarn. If you bought a DIY kit, you should have everything you need, but if you didn't, you can use any chenille yarn that you have lying around, or you can even use smaller yarn or fabric, really anything that's yellow to make these flowers. So we're going to take the remainder of our tube yarn and we're going to cut some strands for our petals. So I'm going to do 3 of these, and you can make them about 5 or so inches long, so just about this size. Then we're going to take our chenille yarn and cut as many strands as we did of the tube yarn, and these are going to need to be a little bit longer, maybe around 8 inches or so. And so you can kind of just estimate the length, and it's better to have a little bit extra. You can always trim it off if you don't need as much. And then we're going to take the inside fluff out of the tube yarn. And so you want to make sure that you get all the strands because we're going to keep these together. So kind of gently get all of those, and then you can peel back that outside fabric. And then grab 1 strand of your chenille yarn, and we're just going to lay it right in the center of that fluff, and we're going to tie a knot here to hold it all together. I'm not using any glue, but if you wanted to make these a little more secure, you could put a little bit on that inside fluff before you make your knot, just to make sure that none of those get pulled out of place. But we're just going to pull this really tightly, and then you have that inside yellow part of your flower, and then the outside fluff are the petals. So once you've kind of pulled that fluff around into a circle, you can grab your scissors, and I recommend doing most of your trimming now before you connect this flower to the cactus, because when you do the trimming when it's connected to the cactus, then this fluff tends to just stick to it all over. And so just trim it as short as you want it. You can kind of experiment with if you like a longer look to the petals or if you want it to be really short, but just keep trimming until you're happy with the look of it. So I'm going to show you 2 different ways to connect the flowers to the top of your cactus. This first way, we're actually going to use a lighter, and so you just want to find the strand that you want to connect your flower to. Put 1 strand of the chenille yarn through the back side of that, and then we're going to grab our lighter and we're going to trim the chenille yarn down short so that it ends up being really tight around that strand of tube yarn. And so chenille yarn is kind of interesting because it has kind of like a plastic inside piece that holds all the fluff together. So you can use a lighter to light that piece on fire and then kind of singe both ends together. Obviously, you just need to be careful not to light the tube yarn on fire or to burn another piece of what you're working on, but you just kind of push those together, and then I usually twist them a little bit so that they really get connected, and then once it cools down a little bit, you can kind of push it together to make sure it's in place. So this is kind of a nice seamless look so that you don't have a knot there, but I realized that doing it this way does make it a little bit looser because it's just kind of hard to get that chenille yarn really tight around the strand of tube yarn. So I'm going to show you another way, which is just using a knot to tie these in place. So you can use a knot if you want it just to be a little bit tighter, or if you just aren't comfortable using a lighter. So I'm going to jump ahead now because we're going to make our flowers in the exact same way. We're just going to connect them differently. So once you have your flower in the size and shape that you want, then you're going to find the next strand on your cactus that you want to connect it to. So you're just going to loop one strand of the chenille yarn underneath, and then you're going to pull it really snug and tight, and then you're going to double knot it. Again, if you want this to be a little more secure, you could use a drop of glue before making the double knot, but I'm just simply tying this here, and then I'm going to push that knot down into the inside of the cactus to hide it. And then at this point, if you need to trim those flowers anymore, you can do that. And I'm going to add one more flower to the top of mine, but you can either be done or add as many as you like. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. I hope that you've enjoyed it and that you enjoy making many of these cacti. If you enjoyed this tutorial, be on the lookout for my chenille yarn cactus coming out soon, and you can find more tutorials on my YouTube channel and website as well. And again, thank you so much for watching. I'm Jessica with Stay Cozy Creative Co. And until next time, stay cozy, creative, and kind.